Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another one of our Wednesday Doctoral Academy talks, information to help you on your postgraduate journey. Today, we're looking at something very important. We are looking at the design of your research instrument or tool, and that can be anything from a questionnaire to how you collect your data or files if you're doing a retrospective review. If you do this step well, your analysis goes easily. If this step is messed up, things could end up very disastrously for you. So Prof. Heft has got immense experience having helped students for many years in their research instruments. So he's the best person to talk on this today. So without wasting any further time, Richard, let me hand over to you. Richard, are you there?
Hi there. Sorry, my controls for muting have disappeared. That's why I couldn't say anything.
Okay.
Okay, it's off the screen. Right. I'm actually trying to display on two screens so that my presentation isn't overwritten by the conversations and chats and things. Might make it possible to keep an eye on who wants to say something. Anyway, thank you very much for that, Colleen. We'll go straight to the presentation. Right, I presume it's on the screen. Designing an instrument.
Yeah, clearly it's visible to all.
Good. So I had to just explain what we were trying to talk about, and I couldn't think of a better word for it than instrument. So I said, the instrument is the instrument which will guide you in eliciting, identifying, and recording your research data at its source. So it's whatever you use to remove the information from its actual source, which might be writing down what a research subject tells you. It might be reading numbers off a machine. It might be, all sorts of things. You've got the information on which you want to research, and then you need some sort of instrument whereby you gather it together, so that the end of it is that you end up with the information you want, that you can then subject to whatever analysis you intend to do. So the principle is very much it's the thing you're using at the source of your data to collect out of all, the millions and millions of things that could be collected, to collect the things that you want. So it guides you in deciding, what information you must take out of your source, identifying that information, and then actually recording it so that you can go away and do something with it. It's often the first step of a two-step process. We'll mention that briefly later. The second step being some form of data capturing, whereby the information goes from your instrument into a database. Now, that may be a genuine computer database. It might be Excel spreadsheets, whatever it is. But the capturing is the stage at which it moves from instrument into that repository of data upon which you're going to exercise your analysis. So remember that is the first of a two-step process. Right. So I think everybody intuitively knows that the instrument is the thing that actually holds the data you collect at the point you elicit it. So you ask the patient or the subject a question, and then you write the answer down. And then you ask them another question, and you write it down. Or you look through the folders and write down the patient's age and their name, or whatever it may be. What people often forget is that it's got a critical role in guiding you in what data you collect. If, for example, you omit date of birth from your instrument, either because you don't think it's necessary or because you just forget. You could very much then end up 6 months later, with a set of results of 300 people and not a single date of birth, even though that might at that stage turn out to be quite critical. So a faulty instrument is actually not just a nuisance. It can lead to very, very serious problems in the amount and the quality of evidence that you've got. So, as always, the two huge dangers to bear in mind, and the first is the famous GIGO, garbage in and garbage out. If your instrument leads you to collect garbage, then you're only going to be left with garbage to analyze. And also huge lost opportunities. And I'm just giving the example. If you decided to capture only age, but not date of birth, if you're not capturing all the data in the same day or the same year, then in fact you can never work backwards to find out what year a patient was born. And that could actually along the line have quite serious repercussions for the quality of the work that you can do. Now, I was involved with such a case. Colleen knows this young man well, one of the surgeons. We wanted to work out survival rates for a particular type of cancer. But it turned out that because various dates were not collected, only things like age and so on, we were unable to work out survival because we didn't have two dates that we could subtract from each other in order to find how many years between the time diagnosed and the time of death. If those dates weren't captured, only the patient's age, for example, then it was impossible to do that. So that's what I mean by lost opportunity. So as always, when I made this talk, I sat down and did a mind map and thought all the way through into all the things that I'd like to say. And as you can see from here, there is a lot, but I'm quite sure that there's a lot that I haven't thought about. And I hope you will think of extra things and will certainly use them. And perhaps you'll be kind enough at the end of this talk to suggest other things that you have found are very, very important. Also bear in mind, of course, instruments are instruments. Everyone is different. A questionnaire to be administered by you is different to a questionnaire to be administered by research assistants, is different to be questionnaires self-administered by subjects, is different from a data capture form you use when looking through folders, and so on, and so on, and so on. So what I've tried to do is just sort of abstract essential, critically important things. Right, so just looking at that first row, the first point there, and if you could just go back and point something else, actually. If you look at the top here, you see I've repeated the same thing. My instrument. What do you want to know? 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 And I could write that down as many times as there are questions in my questionnaire or spaces to be filled in on my instrument. There's no such thing as designing an instrument without extremely careful thought and attention to every single item that you're asking. So that's why I've repeated it there. Everything I'm specifying here applies to one specific item out of the 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, or however many there are on your instrument. And the very first question is, what do you want to know? Okay. And from that, we're going to lead to item design, general design principles, general formatting principles, something about capture and analysis interface, and item quality. So what do you want to know? You have to specify very clearly to yourself your intentions of that particular item. Why do you want to know it? Now, I'm not looking for some sort of woolly, abstract moral principle here. I want something like, so that I can use to subtract from other ages in order to determine survival. If you know what you're going to do with it, then you'll be very careful to collect a date an actual physical date, like the 20th of February, 2022, and not just something vague, like day of admission or something like that. So you have to think ahead to how you're going to use it, and you have to look ahead to the sort of analysis you're going to do. And as I'm repeatedly said, there's a big difference between a number representing an age or a day of admission and an actual date, remembering a date of birth, a date of admission, or whatever it may be. So think about that. You can't go back. It may be too late to go back if you actually realize that the date would have been more important than just a number like 57 representing an age. Have to look ahead. I find this is often something that's actually many people struggle with. I would have said this before, but it's one of the huge problems with coming up with a research question. I have heads of departments, clinical departments, very senior people coming to me with a wonderful research idea. We are going to see if this particular diagnostic test in radiology works better than that. I say, a wonderful question. Now, what are you going to compare with what? And there's a stunned silence. They haven't thought through to the fact that they're going to have to capture a column of numbers on the first type of radiological test and a column of numbers on the second radiological test. And the sort of numbers which can be compared statistically, and if there's a difference, will tell you that test 2 is better than test 1. And often I've found, and people can spend a whole afternoon going round and round that and avoiding actually committing themselves to what it is they are going to measure. So be well aware of that danger. So whatever item it is, whatever it is you're capturing, or whatever question is put down there for a questionnaire, the item must be appropriate for the question you want to ask or answer and your intention with what you're going to do with that data. It must be formulated appropriately for the analysis that you're going to use to answer that question. Okay. And as you know from statistics, types of variable are not interchangeable. Numbers can't be interchanged with text, dates can't be interchanged with numbers. So it's absolutely critical that you know what it is that you want to do. So always remember, WeWo. You probably haven't heard of WeWo because I made it up this afternoon. Woolly thinking in, woolly results out. And I think that often is something that bedevils our research. We may avoid actual garbage in and garbage out, but because of woolly thinking going into it, we get woolly results out that we actually can't use to full advantage. Right. So, sorry, that graph in the corner should have disappeared at this stage. The classic example, we've used this before, is the age that you're going to collect in your instrument. Are you going to write an actual age, like 34? Are you going to put it in age bands, like 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40? Are you going to write down an actual date of birth? So I'll give you some examples of this. Just remember one thing with date of birth. A date of birth is useless if you don't also have a date to compare it with, like date of interview, date of operation, date of death. If you've only got a date of birth, and you've now collected lots of records over a period of months or years, then you can't actually work out what age your patient was when they were admitted. If you've written their date of admission as well, then you can subtract the one from the other and find the age. So cuts both ways. Dates of birth, for instance, can be extremely useful. But if you haven't thought through what it is you'll be subtracting from what, then it could end up being pretty useless. In the age band story, right? If we collected a real age, you see here on our x-axis, we collected an actual age, 11, 12, 15, 20, and so on, 25. We were actually able to do a nice correlation. This is a made-up example. This is Facebook friends on the left. And this is the people's age on the right. And you can see here that the young people certainly looks like they tend to have more friends, and people become a little more discerning as they get older. We can subject that to a classic correlation and work out Pearson's R, which is at the top there, and this is significant. P equals 0.02. If, on the other hand, we had decided to collect the information as 10 to 19, 20 to 29, etc., then it would not be possible to do that correlation. We would have to do something like an analysis of variance, where we compare the mean of each of those bands with the mean of each of the others, which I've done here. And in fact, it turns out to be not significant. It's P equals 0.08. So had you chosen the data this way, you would have got significance. Had you done it this way, you would have lost significance. And the reason is because you have lost data here. You've compressed the richness in being 23 and not 27 out of your age band of 20 to 30. So bear that in mind. Also bear in mind that you can always go from the general back to the specific, but you can't go from the specific back to the general. So if you collected data as years, you could always, after the fact, in your analysis, combine the 20 to 29s into one group, and we sometimes do that, and so on and so on. But if you collected them as 20 to 29, there's no way you can disaggregate them back to 23, 21, 27, 26, and so on. So think through very, very carefully how you collect your data. Right, so that was actually not significant. Minimize the potential for error. This is obviously particularly a problem when it comes to things like questionnaires. Okay. Always consider third parties. You may know exactly what you intend with your question, but if patients or subjects are left to answer it by themselves, you won't believe how easy it is for them to read your question that you thought was pretty obvious and straightforward in a different context and give you an answer that is not what you want and therefore useless for your analysis. And another third party, obviously, is anybody else who has to interpret the data on your instrument, and capture it on the instrument for you, as in a research assistant, or if you hand out questionnaires to your colleagues and ask them to administer them to their students, and so on, and so on. And here I've just put a sort of made up answer, question. Question 4 of this questionnaire was sex. We've handed out 30 questionnaires, that's our sample size. Okay, so your first research assistant comes back. That looks all right. So N equals 30. Your second research assistant comes back with that. When you ask her what's going on, he or she says, oh, I thought the question meant, are they sexually active? Because we were studying contraception, I thought it meant, are they sexually active? So that information is absolutely useless, and your sample size has just dropped to 20. Okay, along comes your third assistant. That also looks sensible until they mention in passing. Isn't it funny how some people have a different self-identified gender to a biological sex? And you say, huh? What do you mean? No. Several of the people told me they weren't prepared for me to put down my biological sex. They wanted their self-identified gender put down. So if they said that they identified as female, I put down female. And you say, no, which ones were those? And they say, I don't remember. Then every single one of these data points is suspect, because you no longer know whether male means male as in XY chromosomes, or male means somebody with XX chromosomes that has identified with the opposite gender. There may even only be 1 or 2 on this whole list, but because you don't know which 1 or 2 they are, all the data is suspect and has to be thrown out. And so your sample size has just become 10. After all the work of collecting the data on 30, it's just become 10. So do not underestimate the ability of people to misread your intentions in things on your instrument. Also be aware of over-specifying things. This can lose a lot of potentially useful information. Here's an example. Question 12. Which drugs were used in the last month? Now, this may even be the sort of thing that's on your instrument you're using to capture data out of hospital records, okay? This is not just a questionnaire that people answer. So you put down valproate, carbamazepine, phenytoin, and other. Now, that's got some advantages. It's obviously far easier and quicker to capture that data because you can put a tick next to the ones that apply, okay? And you can hit something on your computer screen for capturing without having to type it. But there's a major disadvantage. What if somebody is actually taking a different drug, such as clonazepam or lorazepam or ethosuximide or something like that? So they get lumped as other, and now we've got that aggregation problem. We might discover in a year's time that somebody else does the study and comes up with a wonderful paper in Nature to show that ethosuximide does something or other. And you realize that you could have found that yourself, except you didn't capture it as ethosuximide, it went under other, and the effect got totally diluted with all the other drugs. So be extremely careful about lumping things that aren't on your list as other. Looks nice, but it loses a huge amount of information. Right. At the very least, if you have a thing like that, you must write in text the names of all other drugs being taken. So that if it turns out, hey, no, ethosuximide does look interesting, you can then go in your spreadsheet and make a new column called ethosuximide and transfer all the things where people wrote out ethoxuximide into a yes under that column. Easy to do that afterwards, as long as you know they took ethosuximide. So the word other is an extremely dangerous word on any sort of instrument. It's an invitation to lose data. Never put other unless you're absolutely certain, 100%, that there's absolutely no possibility that something's on your list couldn't pop up as being interesting or important far down the line, you know, when you come to analyze things. Right. The other thing, of course, is ambiguity here. Is it absolutely clear whether people, you know, can tick one only or whether they can tick 2 or 3 if they're taking all of them, and so on. Right. Now, being too general can lose a lot of potentially useful information. So here's a sort of, you know, questionnaire that a sociologist or industrial psychologist might dish out. Question 14, do you enjoy your work? And I say, I love being a doctor, so that's a yes, but I hate working at XYZ hospital, that's also my work. So the answer is no. So firstly, it's highly ambiguous, and it's a toss-up whether I write yes or no, because both are partly true. But even if everybody does read it the same way, you've completely lost that potentially useful information of how much mismatch is there between people who enjoy their profession but find themselves working under circumstances that are unpleasant. Right, so watch out. That's a very general question. And it might have been better if it had been split into somewhat more specific questions. Do you enjoy practicing your profession? Question 15. Are you happy in your current working environment? I had enough of a point on that. Right. And of course, aggregating data, we've talked about this before. As a classic example, specify your age, 10 to 29, 20 to 39, 40 to 49, 50 to 59, when it would be almost as easy just to write down 31. And instead of one tick, you've got to write 2 numbers. But at the end of it, as we saw, you could end up with far more useful information had you captured an actual age and not a band. And the same goes for very many things, okay? If you're surveying the schools that our students come from, capture the name of the school. Don't just categorize it at the start as rural or quintile 1 or privileged or less privileged or something like that. It may well turn out that there are things you haven't thought of. For example, quintile 1 schools in one area may produce a different sort of student to quintile 1 schools in a different area. And you can't tell that if all you know about the school is it's quintile 1. But if you know it's quintile 1 and you can look up the name of the school and find it's in Underberg and the name of the other school is in Port Shepstone, then you can actually start to do useful information. So my general advice always is don't aggregate data at the level of the instrument when you collect it. You can aggregate data during the analysis when you decide to take all the quintile 1 schools in one band and all the quintile 2 in another band. But you might wish to split them up into quintile 1 inland and quintile 1 coastal, and so on and so on. So don't aggregate data into bands at the level of collecting the information. Do it later, during the analysis. Right. General formatting principles. Your instrument obviously should be as simple and intuitive as possible. The more complicated it is, the more confused whoever is using it, including yourself, will get, the more likely you are to make mistakes or to misread questions. It needs sufficient instruction, explanation, clarification, and help to avoid all those ambiguities. Sex, change it to biological sex, or say, sex. Enter here the biological sex, do not enter the self-identifying gender. Make it absolutely clear. Right, that's important. So, and the next step I said, is ergonomic. Okay, well, that I mean easy to use. Let's just go down. I think I've made an example here, okay? This is classic for a government form, and I see it often enough in research questionnaires and things too. Here's a place to write all countries visited in the last 10 years. If I've visited even 3 countries, there's not going to be enough space in that little box to write them. And if I visited 10 years, I'll probably just give up. Right. So if you're going to ask for all countries visited in the last 10 years, then you make sure there's enough space for 20 countries. And after that, you write, if the space is insufficient, please turn the page over and write on the back, or something like that. The trouble is with data, if somebody now scribbles 20 names all over that page and way outside the box, it looks messy, but you've still got the data. If they decide just to write the 2 that there's room for and then leave out the other 18, your data now becomes unusable. It's false. It's suspect. So that's what I mean by ergonomic, forms. They must be fit for purpose. It should be a pleasure to fill them out. Should be no difficulty. The difficulty should be in getting the data, not in finding where to put it in and how to put it in and how to squeeze big things into little spaces and what to do with lists of things when there isn't a choice for one of the things, and so on and so on and so on. All of those come under the heading of ergonomic. Okay. I've also suggested that you follow natural process flow. Right. Here's an example of something that's not natural process flow. This might be your instrument that you yourself are using to collect information out of folders, or your research assistant might be doing it for you. Question 20 says age. So you look at the first page of the folder and you write that down. Question 21 says hemoglobin. So you riffle through, 30 laboratory forms and find it and write it down. Then it says sex. So you close all that and you go back to the first page and write down sex. Date of discharge, you turn to the final page of the notes and write that down. Now it wants white cell count, and you've got to go back to those 20 pages of lab notes and work them all again to find the one with the white cell count you wanted. Obviously, you should have asked age, then sex, then date of discharge, then laboratory data, hemoglobin, then white cell count, then platelet count, etc., all together. Now, that's a fairly obvious example, and not many people would muddle it up quite as badly as that. But there are many other examples of how the questions can be structured to maximize the fiddling around and the searching and the looking, instead of following a natural process of this page, then the next page, then the following page, and so on, and so on. So in other words, what you may well be doing here is ordering things to make it easy for the person to capture the data on the instrument. It may make no logical sense in terms of how you're going to analyze it, but that's not the point. Once everything has been captured, you can then go and order your spreadsheet in a way that suits your analysis. Okay. But the instrument is there to collect the data. It's not the template for analysis, as I mentioned earlier. It still has to be captured, and then it can be analyzed. So bear that in mind as well. Right. Obviously, you also want to minimize the workload for yourself or for whoever has to do the work. Okay, and there are many ways of minimizing workload. One is be very careful about asking questions that are quite clearly not going to be of any use, either through the very nature, or if you know that out of your 500 folders, 450 of them don't have a record of whether people play sport or not, then don't ask whether they play sport. That means for 500 folders, your person is going to have to riffle through page after page, only to find that there's no mention of sport. And it'll actually be far harder to identify the ones that don't play sport than the ones that do play sport, because you have to look through every single page and read every single line to see if there's something there about sport. So don't ask questions that you know cannot possibly be used or analyzed. Okay, and as we said, minimize the need to open pages, close pages, turn things over, go back to the registry, reopen the computer, change to other spreadsheets, whatever it is. Okay, minimize the workload. In doing that, you also minimize the potential for error. Okay, when you transfer data from your instrument into the database, which you often call capturing, okay, this is the second area where huge mistakes can be made. Okay, let's use that example we've used already. So we could have a huge mistake at the data collection level because some people thought that sex meant self-identified gender. There could be the same huge mistake if, let's say, for example, on your instrument, both were recorded, but when the instrument is captured, there's only one field now for sex. And now the data capture is going to have to guess which one to write in. And if some data capturers guess at biological sex and put that in, and other data capturers guess at self-identified gender and put that in, then again, every single data point becomes suspect in that database and cannot be used. So you must minimize the potential for error, and I've started there with that, excluding any need for interpretation during capture. It should be quite clear that what's on the instrument is what gets captured on the spreadsheet. There's no need to look at what's on the instrument and to decide what to enter. As soon as you do that, as soon as there's room for interpretation, you end up with extremely suspect data. It's bad enough if you're the only person capturing it. Let me warn you that you'll not believe, how much your interpretation can change a few weeks apart, or with your mood, or with your state of hunger, or something like that. Okay, so avoid the need for interpretation during the capturing of the data, and make as few operations during the capture as possible. Right. If, for example, you ask your data capturer to subtract the date of birth from the date of admission and then to enter the age, you know that a lot of people are going to struggle to subtract 1 year from another. and you're going to get some wildly wrong answers entered into your database. So you don't require them to carry out operations like subtractions and multiplications and so on during the capture. You capture everything. And then you can go at the analysis stage, you can get your database, your spreadsheet, far more accurately to subtract the date of birth from the date of admission and thereby work out age at admission, whatever it may be. So minimize operations during capture and exclude any need for the information on the instrument to be interpreted before it's captured in the database. Right. So there are some ways that you could do this. One of the safest, of course, is direct entry into the database. Now, this is fairly sophisticated, but any of you who've been involved in, for example, community work for very large organizations, particularly, overseas funded organizations, will know that the researchers are going from house to house with a tablet, and they're capturing information in the tablet, and it's going straight up via the internet into the database back there at KRIS or Caprisa or wherever it is. No human intervention at all. So Slim Karim can sit in Caprisa, and as his research officer out there in Tlabisa or something, enters somebody's CD4 count into their tablet within a fraction of a second. Slim could actually be reading it on his computer. But it's not that speed that I'm trying to play up as important here. It's the fact that it minimized the chance of somebody misreading what the researcher had written down and entering it wrongly, okay? Or confusing two bits of data, or confusing the material between two subjects. All of those things are so easy to do when data is captured. Right, so direct entry is really the way to go. But as I said, it's actually very sophisticated, and you do have to protect your database very, very carefully. We'll mention that on the next slide. Okay. There are other things you could, for example, do. You could have people collect the data directly into an Excel spreadsheet, and then you could sit in your office, get everybody's spreadsheets and amalgamate them. And that would, again, remove all the need for somebody to sit there tediously retyping everything that people have already got and maybe making mistakes along the way. But watch out, okay? This automatic import of information is very, very liable to data corruption. Firstly, the software engineers, whoever it is, can't plan on everything. And it may just be if somebody inadvertently, holds down the function key while they tap something into a field, that it sends along some command to your database that crashes the whole thing and completely corrupts it. And then you haven't just lost the information that that particular person was capturing. You've lost all the information that everybody has captured for the last couple of years. So there can be inadvertent system crashes. And I'm not just talking about crashes that happen in the middle of the night. I'm talking about crashes that the person uploading the data actually causes, obviously not on purpose. There can be data loss. Somebody may think the data has been successfully uploaded, but in fact it wasn't. They don't think to tell you anything about it because they thought it was uploaded. And it's only 2 years later when you come to do your analysis that you're very surprised to find you've only got 2,000 data points when you're expecting 2,600. And the reason is that six of your research assistants didn't quite follow through on their phone app. And the result was that the information didn't really get uploaded. Is that possibility? Data overwriting is a huge danger. This is the sort of thing that might happen when you do it yourself. So you collect spreadsheets from 6 research assistants and you try and add them, all the data end to end to end. And at the end of it, you find you've got 60 less than you expected. And the reason is because you actually overwrote 60 with another sheet. That sort of thing is incredibly easy to do as well. Right. Sorry, that next one, there should be non-uniformity. That's the other big problem, okay? I'm going to obviously advise that you make multiple backup and redundant copies so that if things get lost or crashed or overwritten, you can go back and recover most of what has been done. But my own sad experience, in fact, it just happened to me earlier this week, with spreadsheets I was preparing for my statistics course. After making extensive changes to programming, I found out extensive changes to programming for one function on one spreadsheet and extensive changes to something else on the backup spreadsheet. And it was quite a lot of work now to get them both put together on one spreadsheet. And if I hadn't noticed that, I would have totally lost half of that stuff because I would have overwritten the backup copy in due course, not realizing that it contained information that wasn't anywhere else. So lots to think about at this level. So think safety. The whole design of how your information is collected, captured, before we even get to analysis, and that multiple backup and redundant copies. And on my final slide, quality control. I think I've given you some example of all the huge number of things that can actually go wrong with an instrument. So in my experience, people often put them together, particularly questionnaires, extremely slapdashly. I answered one that was sent out by my school, just earlier this week, and there were, out of about 8 questions, 2 or 3 of them were unanswerable because they really were ambiguous, or asked me to tick one of the following boxes and none of them applied, or whatever it may be. So you must review your instrument exhaustively, item by item. It's a critical part of your methods. Your instrument, well, maybe use the word instrument, is just another instrument, as in the cell counter you use, or the fax you use, or the PCR machine you use. It's just another machine, another instrument. And if it's faulty, you're going to have serious problems with garbage out or woolly results out. So you must review it exhaustively, item by item. Get an external review. Get somebody else, supervisors, other people to read through it, and they'll pick up, it's not clear to me what you meant here. Did you mean, are they happy with their profession, or are they happy in their workplace? And then you'll realize that it doesn't convey the meaning you wanted, and you'll go and change it before your research assistants and patients or subjects start messing around with it and giving you unusable information. And lastly, it's often very good to pilot the instrument, that you actually send it out with whoever has to capture data or whoever has to collect data or administer questionnaires. Get them to try 10 or 20 and then come back and report and go through it. Discuss it subject by subject, item by item, in the hope of winkling out some area where the research assistant had in fact not interpreted what you meant quite the way that you wanted it. Right, so I'm going to leave it there, and I certainly hope there'll be some suggestions as to other things we could have said, and possibly some questions.
Thank you so much once again, Richard, for that in-depth talk. I think we should convert it into a chapter in a book one day for how to get on with your PhD. Richard, we can't see you. We can just see your waterfall picture. Your camera might be a little bit far away from you.
It fell off the screen, sorry.
Okay.
There we are. I just fell off the bus.
Okay, there is a question from Shamila in the chat. Prof, how will this work for secondary data or baseline analysis? And while she's asking her question, please, can other people just put your hands up, and we'll let you unmute as we go through the questions.
Okay, I'll have to ask Shamila. I don't quite get the question. Perhaps just explain what you mean.
Shamila, please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Prof. Just let me explain a little more. For example, the rigor that you're explaining for collecting this primary data, how will it apply in secondary data collection and analysis and the instrument? How will that rigor apply in that situation? Because I'm understanding that you're basically taking information from some system that's already preloaded. So how can that apply in this situation?
Okay, so what do you mean by secondary data collection? Maybe it's a technical term that I don't really know.
Okay, say for example, there are assessments results that's preloaded on a system. And basically what the researcher is doing is just extracting that as a baseline for her comparison. So how will that apply? I hope I'm making myself clear.
No, okay, no, certainly clear. Well, then basically I would say your secondary analysis is really the primary analysis. Because for your research project, you are extracting information from a pre-existing bank of information. So you yourself are going to have to design some instrument into which you are going to collect all the stuff that you take off that primary database. That's exactly the same principles will apply. But what you would, of course, have to do in order to make sure that your work is valid, you have to go back very carefully and look at how all that primary information was collected, even though it wasn't collected by you. How rigorously was that collected? Or is it possible that that's riddled with errors in itself? Yeses sometimes and males sometimes and numbers some other times, and all the rest of it. Because your data can never be more secure than the level of reliability and security of the actual data collected first time round. So does that help at all?
Thank you, Prof. It really answers a lot. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? I'd like to make a point, and I can't remember if you went through this, Richard, that sometimes you can get already validated instruments that can be used, but you have to actually see that they will work in your context. Would you like to talk about that?
Okay, right. This is looking at a somewhat more technical form of instrument. Okay, this is not just you designing the items that you would like to see for your research. This is when one of the things that you would like to have or see for your research is something that can be reduced to a data point by some other means. And in this case, an instrument already developed by somebody else. So the classic example, for example, might be Beck's depression inventory or something like that. So one of the questions on your own instrument, along with age and gender and place of domicile and income, might be depression score. And for that, a question arises. You have to put in a number there, 15 or 20, or whatever it is. So how are you going to arrive at that number? That in itself requires an instrument. The instrument that says, do you wake up at night feeling sad? Do you often cry? Have you ever considered suicide, etc.? You're going to have to ask all of those questions in order to come up with a score. But now there are two choices. Either you can invent your own questions, all right, and add them all together to give a score. Or you can go out there and use somebody else's instrument like Beck's depression inventory, where you just read out sing-song voice, all the questions it asks, and write down the numbers, and they get added up afterwards. But now comes the question of reliability and validity. We have to know that if my depression score on your instrument says 15 and Colleen's says 10, we have to know that I am actually more depressed than Colleen. I must also know whether I am, 1.5 times as depressed as Colleen. Does 15 actually mean 1.5 times 10? And you may think it does, and others may absolutely disagree and say, how do you know that people who report crying from time to time are really depressed? Some people just cry easily. Maybe they cry because they're so happy about something. So now you've got a problem. People don't want to believe your score. So you then have to go out and validate that sub-instrument you used to get the depression score. That's a whole study in itself, where you collect a lot of people with a lot of scores, and you correlate that with some other objective gold standard score for depression and show that it works. That 15 being greater than 10 does mean more depression than somebody else. That is a huge amount of work. It lays yourself open to lots of trouble. And it's often, publishable in its own right. But the other alternative is to go out and take an inventory that has already been validated by other people. So if you go and look for Beck's depression inventory and you Google it, eventually you'll go back to papers where it was first described and it was validated, so that people can see that it really does work. So that's the first half of Colleen's question. The second half, of course, is yes, but Beck's depression inventory might have been trialed out and validated in white North Americans, for example, aged between 30 and 60. You now want to go and give it to Black adolescents in KwaZulu-Natal. And the whole big question arises as to whether validation in older whites in North America can be just automatically transferred to Black youth in South Africa. And many people will be extremely worried about that, and almost certainly, at the very least, ask for a very careful, reasoned explanation of why you believe it's valid. But they may go straight out and reject your paper and say they want to see this instrument validated before they accept all the rest of your work. So you've either now got to go out and find some other instrument that has been validated in Black youth in South Africa, or in a population that's close enough that it's reasonable to transfer it. Or you actually have to go out and design your own instrument and validate that. You can probably publish that in its own right, and you'll now become the author of the Kokela, African Youth Depression Inventory, or whatever it may be. But that's a step before you can even get on with what your actual project was, which was looking at the effect of illness on well-being. Everything from, days lost at school to income to number of friends. And just one of those items was depression. So it's a rather long answer, but I hope it makes the point.
Thank you so much. It's definitely not a shortcut to go and get a previously validated questionnaire at times. Yunela, your hand is up, and Joyce will get back to you after Yunela.
Thank you, Prof. My question is more on the ethics and ethical clearance matters. So let's say I have piloted my instrument and there has been significant changes. Do I have to resubmit it to the ethics committee?
Shall I take that one,
Yes,
Richard?
Colleen.
Yeah, it depends on how much you've changed. If you've only changed a couple of questions, like, for example, you've changed the way you've asked 6, then all you do is write a letter to Break to say these are the couple of changes you've made. If you make big changes and ask new questions, more personal questions, etc., you might just send them a letter with your new questionnaire and ask them if it needs to go back for review. But mostly just a letter is going to be sufficient if you're going to make those kinds of changes. But then again, this is not a one-size-fits-all answer. It depends on how much you're changing and how much it's going to affect your bigger study.
All
Yeah.
right, thank you so much.
But just start off with a letter, and that usually will give you an instruction within a week or so.
All right, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Joyce, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Joyce, are you still with us?
Yes.
Okay, go
Thank
ahead.
you. Thank you, Professor Colleen. I would like to know, how do we test for the reliability of the instrument that we're using to collect the data? Because this is the most of the question that sometimes we receive from the reviewer, that how reliable was the tool that he used to collect the data? Do you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Just-
Richard, this is a question for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just rephrase it again. I'm not 100% sure that I've got it.
I'm asking, how do we test for reliability of our tools before starting the data collection? Like how, because I have seen some of the paper presenting the inter-rater reliability was 86, 96, but I don't know what is it. That is what I want to know.
Okay. My answer to that is going to be that I'm quite certain that the answer to that is at the very least, a lecture on its own, and in fact, probably a course. It's actually a very complicated process. And it's going to vary greatly according to what it is, whose reliability you're trying to assess. So I really can't handle it in a few minutes now, and I'm probably not the expert on it either. For a start, you have to know the meanings of the term reliability and validity. And by the way, they aren't the full story either. Usually other people include other terms as well. But those actually originally come from philosophy. And reliability is the same as reproducibility. In other words, if I score 16 on depression today with you, and then Colleen comes and does the instrument today, will I still score 16, or is there a chance that the way she asks the questions, I might now score 12 or 20? If so, it's not reliable. Similarly, if I'm of exactly the same level of depression next week, but next week my score comes back as 10 or 20, then it's not reliable. If it's 16 today when you ask me, it should be 16 tomorrow when Colleen asks me. So that's reliability. And the only way you can actually prove that is by going through those exact steps of setting up the circumstances so that they do not change, and then getting different people on different occasions to administer the instrument. So that, in a nutshell, is how you would handle reliability, but it can be a very, very lengthy process. You also, of course, would almost certainly include some sort of statistical step, and the various statistical tests that are used to confirm reliability. The Cronbach's alpha and things like that, which are measures of the variation between two things. You would have to show that the variation between the test administered by Colleen is less than a certain amount than the variation when it's administered by me, and so on and so on. So as I say, people write books on this sort of thing, and people present whole courses, and almost certainly you find university modules on this sort of thing. So do some reading on it yourself, and maybe, Colleen, it's something that we really should put together to teach. The second is validity. Validity means that the thing is actually measuring what you say it's measuring. Okay, so it may be very well that I score 16 on my depression inventory today, and next week I also score 16, even though somebody else is doing it. That's reliable. But if it turns out that if I'm twice as depressed as today, and next week I still score 16, then the test is not valid. It's actually not measuring what it says it's measuring. It's not going up with increasing depression. Maybe it's measuring something else. Happiness with life, which is not the same as clinical depression, something like that. So that's validity. That is usually more a case of arguing why it's valid rather than doing calculations. Reliability usually comes down to calculations to show that there's no change across different times and people when the instrument is administered. Thank you.
I think before everybody gets terrified about reliability and validity, today we've spoken about all sorts of instruments from sitting in front of a computer with patient records in front of you, where you're taking age, sex, blood results, etc. That you're not going to need to go through the whole reliability and validity exercise. But one little piece of advice, and Prof. Hef did mention this, once you've drawn up your questionnaire, send it out for comment, get people to comment on it, try it out on your friends. And that will give you some certainty or some assurance that you're going to be asking the questions that you require. So there are no more questions. We've reached our 4:30 mark. Thank you to everybody who's attended, and we'll see you again next week at the same time and same place. Thank you for attending. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.